Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Mr Chairman, I'm very pleased to follow on from my colleague Carol Beaumont and really to pick up where she left off, and that is to kind of reinforce the view on this side of the House that the vulnerable consumer is who requires our protection. And I also want to talk a little bit, and I know that I kind of bang on about regulation and people kind of get sick of the fact that I'm really interested in regulation, but this is a really good process and I kind of want to commend it for the process that has been adopted. And Carol Beaumont mentioned it in her contribution on this debate, but this was a legislation passed in 2003 that had a 2-year review built into the legislation. And I quite like that concept because sometimes 2 years might be too soon, but actually given how long it's taken for that 2-year review to turn into something practical in front of the House today, maybe 2 years is a good time to get things cracking anyway. So what that did was that it enabled a new regulatory framework that had been put in place to be subject to the test of time and experience and the contribution of major stakeholders. I was going to use that word key, but I've stopped using that. I've just identified the ones that they consulted with: the Motor Trade Association, the Independent Motor Vehicle Dealers Association, the Motor Industry Association, the New Zealand Automobile Association, and Consumer New Zealand Incorporated. And what that managed to do, and that's not a full list, but that shows you the degree of stakeholder engagement in a really good process of review. So I want to commend the process to Parliament and to the new Minister who's taken up this role as the champion of consumers, which I hope that's how he sees his role as Minister of Consumer Affairs. It certainly has been my experience of working with him on the Commerce Select Committee. In fact, he was probably a member of the Commerce Select Committee when this bill came to us, and he will recall the work that we put into it. Now, one of the things that I thought was also useful was that the review process picked up a number of recommendations, and I think there were a dozen in total, many of which are picked up now in this bill. But post the review, it was then a discussion document was then set out with the proposed amendments to the Act. That was released in March 2007 for discussion. Now, there's a little bit of a gap in time here, and I know that a general election kind of intervened, and that may have something to do with it. But the bill was introduced into Parliament on the 26th of May last year. It came to the very efficient and excellent Commerce Select Committee, who reported it back on the 14th of December 2009. So why are we dealing with it under urgency on a Thursday morning? We would normally be having the Commerce Select Committee undertaking its very important work, but in fact we're in the House under urgency. The date on the wall says the 24th, but I know that it isn't really the 24th, it's the 26th, because under urgency in this place alone, time stands still, and we are still on Tuesday because that's when we entered the urgency regime. Now, I did notice that the government have used the expression of extended sitting hours, and I just want to put on record that I really support the change of the name to extended sitting hours, because there is the use of the word urgency that indicates that things are urgent, and if this was urgent it would have been dealt with before Christmas last year, and it is definitely not urgent. So I would really support the idea of going to the Standing Orders Committee and saying we will change in our standing orders the expression urgency. We will use the word urgency for what is genuinely now referred to as extraordinary urgency, but for urgency where the House has to deal with a matter through all of its stages immediately. Usually it's post-budget, but on other occasions as well. Often when we find that there's some fault with the law and we have to correct it very quickly, those sort of cases, that's genuine urgency. This extended sitting hours of the House, I think, should be called extended sitting hours. Now, I know that I'm kind of slipping away, but I am allowed to refer to the context of the discussion that we're having at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and why our wall says 24th when it's it was Thursday morning, when the wall says Tuesday morning. Yeah, 24th, yeah, forever Tuesday. Actually, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, that would make a really good song, I reckon. Yeah, I am diverting, but let's get back to the really serious issue, which is that we had an excellent process put in place to make sure that this bill would remain, would be capable of being refreshed after the experience of its operation. So that's what this bill essentially is it is an opportunity to refresh the situation. And I think this is indicative of the degree of consultation, and I'll give credit to the officials for the degree of consultation that occurred, is that the closing date for submissions was the 20th of August 2009. We received and considered 8 submissions from interested groups and individuals, and we heard 2 submissions. Now, I'm actually going to give credit to the Ministry of Consumer Affairs and the excellent advisors that we have from that ministry. And the reason that I give credit to them is that if it had been controversial, there would have been a lot more interest in it. The fact that they were able to do so much consultation prior to its arrival in Parliament by way of the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill, see, I got it in there, that's why I think that there was so little controversy or commentary around it. Now, dealing with the specific provisions of the bill, which I'm sure the Chair is really keen that I get onto, one of the issues that we have managed to do here is to, I think, update the legislation so that it speaks to the modern environment, the electronic environment that we all operate in. And so we've recommended that Clause 7 be amended to make it clear that the Motor Vehicle Sales Act requires motor vehicle traders to display a consumer information notice when displaying or offering for sale a used motor vehicle physically, or when displaying or offering for sale a used motor vehicle over the internet, when a contract to buy the motor vehicle can be entered into online. And that is the critical point that I wanted to emphasise on this, because it's not a question of having a consumer information notice on every single page where there's a car offered for sale on Trade Me or whatever website people are on, but when you can enter into the contract to buy online, then that information needs to be made available. And I think that's really important. Consumers need to have access to that information before they enter into the transaction itself. And the purpose of the change that we made in the bill was to distinguish between internet advertisements that offer the ability to enter into a contract to buy the vehicle online and therefore should display a consumer information notice, and advertisements that are effectively the same as classified advertisements in your local newspaper, for which the provision of a consumer information notice would be an unnecessary and onerous requirement. And I think that's a very sensible arrangement that we've entered into. I personally wouldn't buy a car on the internet. I've bought other things on Trade Me, but I certainly haven't bought a car. I think the Chair might rule me out of order if I started talking about the lenses for my lovely Canon SLR camera, you know. But we won't go into that. Well, we won't go into my photography being my favourite hobby outside this place either, but the point that I'm making is that the purpose of the legislation is to have a regulatory framework that is fit for purpose, and you've got to take into account the new environments within which people make purchases. It took me a long time to feel that I could make a secure purchase on the internet. I've now managed to do that with DVDs off DVDs. I'm not going to try and table one as an example, just in case I am told that it's not a document. But the point that I'm making is that if we don't have wording in our legislation matching the changes in technology, then it will simply not be able to achieve its purpose. So I'm very pleased with the changes that have been made to make this a modern piece of legislation. We were obviously the government that introduced the original legislation. This government has managed to update it, and I certainly pay tribute to them for that. Can I also acknowledge the former minister who played a very important role, and I also want to compliment her on her presentations to the Commerce Select Committee. I thought that she was excellent, and